get to work. Lord, thank you for this morning. God, thank you as we come in and we see family. We are able to connect. God, I pray increasingly that we would be able to connect with one another in genuine ways. God, if maybe we show up with a compulsion to fake it, thinking that we have to in order to be accepted, would you just break into that space? Wherever that lie is that we feel like we can't bring truth. We can't bring what's actually going on. Would you just break down that wall? God, I've been there. I know many others have been there. If there's anyone here today that is buying the lie that acceptance requires faking, would you just dismiss that this morning? God, as we talk about your church and what you've called us to, would you just open up our eyes to see? Would you transform our hearts? Would we truly see you for who you are and what you've done and what that means for how we live and all the things? And just thank you for each person here. We love you. In your name, amen. All right. How many of you know someone, maybe you have a friend or an uncle or even a grandparent that you find that they're constantly telling the same story over and over again? You know, like you're chuckling, like you go to Thanksgiving or family reunion and you see Uncle Bob walking up to you and you're like, oh, here it goes. Like, I know how this is going to end up. I've heard the same story over and over again. In fact, at this point, I could probably tell the story better than he could. You guys have those people in your life? Raise your hand. No? Nobody? Okay, if you don't have anyone in your life like that, then there's a decent chance that you are the person that is constantly telling the same story, because we all do. Like, there's people in every family, every friend group who are like, oh, yeah, there goes Tyler again talking about whatever he did in high school. Like, okay, we get it. Be quiet. So those types of things, like, we get it. And sometimes that's funny. Maybe it's a little bit sad, depending on the reasons for that. But people can just bring up the same things over and over again. But sometimes, I believe it's actually really important to bring up the same things over and over again. In a different light, though, things that are valuable, things that matter or make a difference. In fact, as Patrick mentioned last week, we like to do this at this time of the year, is revisit the things we call same things that keep us rooted, things that guard us from drifting, right? Like things that are essential. What is important to us? What is good for us? Same things. We also see this precedent in Scripture. We see this play out in Scripture. Paul does this clearly in Philippians chapter 3 when he's talking to the church. He says, finally, my brothers, this is in chapter 3, rejoice in the Lord, he says. To write the same things to you is no trouble to me, and it is safe for you. Here Paul is revisiting things that he's already taught this church. He's getting back to some of the basics. He's already taught them, and he's like, it is no trouble for me to teach them again. First of all, it's easy because I've already done it. I'm not creating new content or studying to create new context or interpretation. But he also sees that the repetition is helpful, and the repetition emphasizes things that are important in Scripture. Helpful for the church, but also, I think, helpful for himself, right? Because he's not just dishing out the truth that is helpful for people. He has to practice and rehearse that to guard what's in here, right? That's true for all of us, not just for Paul, not just for pastors, for all of us. We can be so quick to talk about how great the mercy is to people that are struggling, recognizing that that's for them, and have a really hard time believing it ourselves. Right? You've been there maybe as a dad or a mom or a friend and been like, oh man, don't believe that. Like, this is what God has done. But in your own heart, you struggle to believe that to be applicable. So we want to rehearse the truths of the gospel. Sometimes we don't, though. We're tired of same things, and we think the gospel might just be for people that don't know Jesus yet, right? Or new people to the church. Yeah, they should get the gospel. But once we get the gospel, we can move on from that. Now that we're saved, now that we get it, we can get on to the important stuff, right? And think that it's It's time to move on from the gospel to the other things in Scripture that we might be curious about. And I think it's just really important to make clear that the gospel is the important stuff. The gospel in every page of this book is the important stuff, and it's all pointing to Jesus. Some people are just tempted, though, to move on from that and get into all the things, the mysterious things, the prophecies, the end time stuff, or even like weird stuff like fallen angels and the Nephilim and those types of things, and like, well, what else could we find out? And forget the gospel. Move on from the gospel. I think the moment you think you need to move on the gospel is the moment you need to rehearse the gospel the most. If you finally get to a point where you're like, okay, I got that. I've graduated from the gospel, and now I can focus on all the things about me. That's a big red flag. And that's why I think Paul and us as a church want to talk about the same things, because we always need the gospel as one of those same things. So for us, same things are things that we don't ever want to leave up for assumption or take for granted. And here at Valley Life, we have stated 6 core values. Patrick covered these last week, and they're all organized under the banner that mission matters. Not missions matter, that's going to be one of our core values, but mission, the mission of God, of His plan to bring all people to Himself, to push back darkness and establish His glorious light. Like, we have been invited into that mission. And so under that banner of mission matters, we're aware of what God is doing, and we think we should be up to what He is up to. And the 6 values we have underneath that banner then are, for sure, Scripture matters. Scripture matters. The gospel matters. Community matters. Family matters. Missions matter. You see, we just swapped an S. Mission matters, and because mission matter, missions also matter, right? From our neighborhoods to Guatemala to La Grande, planting churches. Like, if you weren't around, we planted a church out of here before I came along. Tanner Sheehan planted a church in La Grande 7 years ago. And right now, Patrick is preaching at that church over in La Grande. And so meant to pray for them. We'll cover that later. But excited that we still get to partner with the churches that we helped plant. And over and finally, leadership matters. Those are our core values. And over the last couple of years, we've just been tried to be more intentional about getting those out in front of your face, keeping these values in front of you so that you're aware, like, what is my church value? These are the main ones, and everything else comes out of those places. And last week, Patrick preached on the core value that the gospel matters. And I think my hope is that in all of our sermons, you will see all of these core values represented. For sure, the gospel matters. And I'm so glad he started there, because that 100% informs why community matters, which is the core value I'll be preaching on this morning. So if you missed the Gospel Matters sermon last week, highly recommend going back and watching that online. But one of the things Patrick kept repeating was one of these same things he kept on talking about was this idea that we have not been saved by our works, but what? We have been saved for works, right? And we actually get to see that played out in the text that we're going to look at today. And the order here, it is really important to rehearse that we've been saved for works. We don't work to be saved. We get that wrong all the time. Last week he was in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. I'm going to stay in the same book today, but we'll be in Ephesians chapter 4. We'll see in the text how Paul articulated to the Ephesian church and the same order that he articulated in this letter is repeated through all the letters, really, that he wrote to churches, all the different churches he wrote to. There is a specific call for the people in the church to remember how they got their identity. Remember that it was Christ's work on their behalf that bought them. And then a follow-up to, now that you have been bought, now that you have been purchased, now that you belong to me, get to work. I want to use you. I'm excited to invite you into this mission. So there is a call for us to get to work as Christians, for us to live a certain way as Christians. But as you're going to see here in a second, and all the other letters, it is very clear that our works are a response to what God has done. And you've probably gotten this backwards. I've gotten this backwards. Maybe you don't get this backwards intellectually, but practically you've gotten this backwards. And I would say this is maybe one of the ways we move on from the gospel or mistakenly act like we've graduated or arrived because we're not rehearsing the gospel. And maybe intellectually we get it, but practically we get this backwards. It's always built out in the first part of these letters. All that God has done for his people. This great work of reconciliation, of him seeing his lost children running in darkness, children of wrath like the rest of mankind, but then this beautiful rescuing he does. While we were still dead, he died in our place. He pursued us. He redeemed us. He set us free, and that is all driven out of this perfect love that he has for us, making it very clear that his love was not a response to anything that we did. Look, there was never some shining moment in your life that compelled God to love you more. There was never a moment in your life where all of a sudden God was captivated by your behavior. He loved you at your worst, and he saw you in darkness, and he said, "You are mine." Not because you're doing great, not because you finally figured something out, but because I love you. Not because you're good, but because I'm good. And that has got to be the baseline. Otherwise, we're going to work our butts off to try to get him to love us when he already has. You tracking? His love and mercy were a free gift. We did not deserve or desire prior to him making the first move. Paul wanted these churches to see that it was Christ's work, not ours, that resulted in the reconciliation. And the way we get this backwards, which I've already touched on, the way we get this backwards is we read all the second half of these letters. We're going to look at chapter 4 today. We read the second half of these letters and we think, oh, there's the list. He's here, he's told me all the things that I should do now that I'm a Christian, and we think this is my list to get his love. Or if I'm not doing this, I might lose his love, and that was never meant to be that way. Right? That was never the plan. It was, I love you no matter what, unconditionally, now go do this. And instead we see, oh, here's the things I need to do so that he doesn't stop loving me. Right? And when we don't live up to them, we just assume we're not lovable. Why would he love me if I can't do what he called me to do? That exposes a fundamental problem in how we think we were saved. It exposes a fundamental error in what got us the grace that we were given. That we somehow did it. And I think that actually extrapolates out into our relationships with other people, right? So often our go-to response is to try our hardest to be fake church people that present an acceptable version of ourselves to God so that he'll love us, but also to others so that they'll accept us. Right? We show up knowing all the right things to say because we've been at church for a while and we see what that looks like, and totally go like mist and unknown. Because we think that our acceptance and love is riding on how good we can fake it. That is absent from this. But the gospel truth of chapter 2 in Ephesians informs how we will live out chapter 4. We get to show up and tell the truth about our lives and still be loved. We get to be human. We get to be imperfect and still belong. Let's look real quickly at Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 8. Paul says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. Not a result of works, so that no one may boast." It's worth freezing right there. Like if you memorize one verse, I don't know if I haven't thought this out, but if you memorize one verse, consider that being one of the top ones you memorize. To know your identity is firmly in Christ because of what he's done. Patrick referred to this verse last week as the great leveler. The great level. It puts all of us on the same playing field, right? It's not like some of us tried out better than others and we got on the team. We were all saved not by our works, but by the grace of God. And your acceptance and your identity are firmly, firmly held in the grip of the grace of God. My hope is that that just lets you exhale a little bit. You don't have to feel like you're trying out all the time. And I mean trying out to be accepted by God and accepted by others. Right? So we're not saved by our works. Well, technically, no, we're not saved by works. Technically, we are saved by Christ's works, but not our works. Not saved by our own works. However, in verse 10, we see that we are called to be what? His workmanship, created for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So he's going to put us to work. And it's not just some response, oh, this guy looks like he could do this. He has prepared these for us beforehand so that we should walk in them. And he's going to call us to live in a certain way that is good for us and brings glory to him. Right? It's not just, this is going to be horrible for you every day of your life, but it's going to be good for God. No, he's going to call us to live in a way that is good for us, challenging at times, for sure, but good for us and brings glory to God. And for centuries, he has been pushing back darkness and establishing his glorious light in neighborhoods and communities and cities just like ours through this plan. Through calling his people, redeeming, rescuing them, and putting them to work. Calling us to be a church that is participating in his plan. He knows what is good for us. He knows what is good for humanity. He created it. He has to know what's good for, right? And as his workmanship, he's going to use us to do that work. To put it super simply, if you have been saved, then you have been called to participate, not to spectate. I don't know if that's too harsh, but it's simple and not easy. If you have been saved, you have been called to be a participating part of the bride of Christ, not to spectate. And I think something has happened in the last 50 or so years where Christianity has kind of turned into like a big spectator sport with giant churches and fancy lights and big bands and eloquent preachers that people can just come to the church concert completely anonymously and then go home never being known or loved and come back week after week to be entertained or maybe encouraged, but not actually belong. And that doesn't just happen in mega churches, right? Like we can do that here. We do that here. But we have been called to community, to love one another, to be the bride of Christ, to be brothers and sisters together on mission. And not just to fulfill our duty for the sake of others, but because it's really, really good for us. Because we need it. We have to have it. That's what we were designed for. Turn with me to chapter 4 real quick. It's probably worth noting just like a little bit of context for Ephesians. If you're not familiar, Ephesians was a big port city. So he's not just talking to a church that has people that are all just alike, right? This would be a city more like Seattle or San Francisco with lots of diversity and different ideologies present and different schemes going on out in the city. And these people would come together and be unified under Christ, which makes it perhaps even more complicated, maybe even than our context. I want to spend most of our time in verse 11, but I think we should read verse 1 first. Paul says, I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Verse 2, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. I just want to see that Paul is really urging his church to something, and is therefore referencing the fact that we have been saved, that this church has been saved, this church has been called, but that's just the beginning. Now it's time to walk in a manner worthy of that calling. Walk in a manner worthy of how they've been called. And he gets that the church is messy. He gets that people are complicated. He gets that it's going to take a lot of humility, gentleness, and patience to do this the right way. There's going to actually be many times that in order to maintain the unity, the church is going to have to bear with one another. It's going to be hard. There's going to need to be a lot of forgiveness. There's going to have to be some vulnerability, and that's going to get messy. Amen? They're not going to come by gentleness naturally. Can you relate to that? Do you come by gentleness naturally? In fact, there were probably times where they didn't want to be gentle with one another at all. But in order to maintain the unity and this bond of peace that comes from Christ, they must. If they were just spectators at church, they wouldn't need to focus on any of this stuff. Right? Like the things he's calling them to, like if they were just spectators that showed up and left and came back, like why would they need to have any of this instruction to do life together? In fact, maybe that's what keeps us from participating. The fear that church can get messy. The fear that if I'm really myself with these people, I might be rejected. And the reality is what? You might. Maybe you have, which makes it way harder to do it again. Right? We often don't fear some unknown thing. We usually fear something bad happening again. And so that's what makes it hard. That's what can kind of keep us on the sidelines. Like, man, I've been hurt by church before. I've been hurt being vulnerable before. So if I step back in, what if I get hurt again? And there's no 100% insurance that you won't. I'm not going to stand up here and say hey, just being fully known is just a risk-free endeavor. You could get hurt. But to be fully known and fully loved instead of rejected is incredibly life-giving. And God knows that, and that's what Paul is calling this church to and what God is calling us to. This isn't a new idea, by the way. We have to remember we were created for this. Even before the fall, before sin ever touched the earth, God looked and saw that it was not good for what? For us to be alone. Not because things had gone sideways and Adam was just really lonely and complaining. God's like, that's not good. It's not good that he be alone. And that wasn't just about marriage, by the way. In fact, look, you can be married and still be lonely. Don't nudge your spouse right now. But you can be in marriage and still be lonely. This was about people made in the image of God were designed and wired to have community because God has community. The Trinity itself is community. And we were made in the image of God for community. We might think that avoiding this is safe or less awkward, but the reality is without real community, we will become incredibly lonely. Because we're missing something that we were created to need. And this isn't like some discovered or invented idea that we should have community with people. This has been the plan all along. To have community, real community, with God and one another. Genuine, authentic, masks off, elbows on the table, community. And when we don't, we experience a deep loneliness. And I know there are people in this room that could tell you a lot about loneliness. Justin Whitmore earlier deals with this a lot in this book, Made for People, Why We Drift into Loneliness and How to Fight for a Life of Relationship, a Friendship. Really encourage you guys to read that. I'm going to read actually a big chunk out of it now on loneliness because it landed with me in a way that felt real. He says, if you are like me, you may bristle at the word loneliness. It can carry a sense of judgment, like a sickness we don't want to get caught having. What I mean by loneliness is this: the feeling of being a person who used to have friends. This loneliness is a universal struggle. It is a spiritual and physical reality that every single person will grapple with at multiple points in their life. It is not exactly the picture of a kid on the other end of a playground kicking rocks while all the cool kids do something fun. Many of us have experienced being an outcast, but that's only one version of loneliness. There are many, and they do not all look the same. Loneliness comes from losing a loved one. Loneliness comes from moving away. It comes from changing churches or seeing the small group dissolve. It comes from being excluded or breaking up. It comes from divorce or being hurt by someone. But often, strangely, it also comes when you're surrounded by everyone but don't feel known by anyone. Loneliness is the ache for something you used to have, often an ache you cannot even name, as if relationship drifted away silently during the night, and you woke up in a world you cannot explain. He goes on to say this, that this is the new normal of modern life. We are the most physically connected and yet spiritually isolated people who have ever walked the planet. Our default perspective should now be to assume that if you're a modern American, you are lonely. This is a spiritual crisis, not just a social one. I think it's really important to clarify that we didn't create community to combat loneliness. That could kind of be like read between the lines, and that's what I'm talking about. We didn't create community to combat loneliness. We experience loneliness because we're missing the community we were wired for. See the difference? We're not like, oh man, loneliness sucks. What do I do to fix it? Oh, let's try this new thing I read about called community. God is like, you are wired for community. And when you don't have it, when you don't have what you were wired for, you're going to be lonely. And the world is figuring this out. Right? It's in here, but it's very experiential as well. Like even psychology today reports, we are built for social contact. Notice how they said built. We are built for social contact. There are serious life-threatening consequences when we don't get enough. Loneliness increasingly appears to be the cause of a range of medical problems, some of which take decades to show up. Look, there is nothing that thrives or even survives when it's missing something that it was created for. Think about it. This poor palm plant that was sitting in the foyer for like 6 months without being watered, I finally took it out because it was just dead. Right? And it wasn't because it was lonely, but it wasn't getting water. It was created to need water and sun. And now it's dead. Right? You were created to have community. And without it, you will die. When we're missing something that we were created to need, life will look much different. We are seeing in so many different ways, I think, how science, specifically neuroscience, is catching up to Scripture. And I think this is one of them. So congratulations, Psychology Today. But this is not just some new idea that I picked up at a conference or in an article. Like, you need it. It's in here. I need it. We need community and relationship to survive. And I know for a fact that there's people in this room that have experienced deep loneliness. This feeling like no one really knows them, and if they did, they would be rejected. And it's not always the quiet people in the corner, right? Like he talked about that. You can be around a lot of people and still be lonely. How so? For many people, their entire experience of being around others is to put on a show to gain acceptance. That's a super lonely spot. I've been there. It's a super lonely spot. Constantly trying to convince all these people how great you are so that you will finally feel accepted. And then you read the gospel and what Ephesians chapter 2 just said, and that looks totally different. When we remember the gospel and we remember that we are saved by grace, not by our own works, and that we have acceptance and approval in Christ, then we don't have to fight for it. We don't have to try out for it. Chip Dodd says that God gave us loneliness so we would seek out relationship. Loneliness is a feeling that speaks to our deep hunger to belong and to be known. What if that's how we saw loneliness? Because you will all experience loneliness. We experience loneliness. But what if instead of beating ourselves up over it and believing that we're just worthless losers and nobody wants us, what if we saw loneliness as a gift or a nudge from God to go participate in community? What if we felt him saying, hey, you need something that you were made for. It's missing right now. Go get it. And we felt this urgency to seek out being known when we were lonely, to go create relationships where we can be known and loved, to have real, authentic friendships. In this broken world, we don't drift into community. We drift into loneliness and isolation. Let's jump to verse 11 in chapter 4. And he gave the apostles and the prophets and the evangelists and the shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. Okay. I know we've read that before, but that is a big deal, right? Whose job is it to build up the body of Christ? Just the shepherds and teachers? No. The saints. Who's that? You guys, right? We as pastors are trying to equip the saints and the family to build up the body of Christ. Why? Well, verse 13 says that. Until we attain all the unity of the faith, and of the knowledge of the Son of God to mature manhood, to the measure and the stature of the fullness of Christ. That is a big job. And you are called to participate in that job. Right? There's no room for a spectator sport when the body and the saints are called to do that work. It's a participating relationship. To love one another, to disciple one another, that results in unity and maturity. And when you are united and when you are mature in Christ, things look different. You are no longer, like verse 14 says, children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, every human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. Look, you are probably aware, maybe you've potentially heard some cunning doctrine out there or some deceitful schemes out there, maybe. Maybe you know someone who has been tossed to and fro by the fleeting ideologies and ideas of this world. Most likely you have been in those shoes. I've been in those shoes. Maybe that's the extent, though, that community has been for you. Maybe you just have drinking buddies. Maybe you just have friends that you can talk about sports and politics with. And your friends might know your favorite baseball team. They might know your entire fantasy football roster, and they might know who you're voting for and why you're certainly not voting for the other person. But they know nothing about what's going on in here. Guys, that's so lonely. To be able to show up with your best friends and not share anything that's going on in here? You were wired to be in those types of relationships. And if that's missing, you are missing out on a great gift from the Lord. And I get emotional about that. Because being lonely sucks. And you were created for more. So much more than jokes, politics, and sports. And look, I love jokes and sports. Some politics. But if that was all I could ever talk about with my friends, I remember what that's like. It's really lonely. Belonging to a gospel-centered community that is striving for maturity and unity invites us into so much more. There's actually another option. Look at verse 15. Paul says, rather, speaking truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. This is what true gospel community does. It's a contrasting thing. Can you see the difference, the contrast of being tossed to and fro by deceitful and worldly cunning schemes and all that stuff to this? It's two different kingdoms, two different ways to live in community. Rather, speaking truth in love. What does that mean? What does it look like to speak truth in love to one another? You might think, oh, I know what speaking truth in love looks like. That's when I just come in and share a tough word, some tough love with my buddy. Like, hey, I don't want to be rude, but since I love you, I need to tell you that you smell, and you need to wear deodorant. Look, if you are in middle school, that might be true. Just kidding, kind of. But he's saying, no, speak the truths of Christ. Speak the truth of the love of Christ into one another. Remind each other that your identity is in Christ's work, not your own work. Speak the truths of Jesus into the spaces that people aren't believing the gospel. Speak the truths of Jesus into the spaces that people aren't believing the gospel. One of my favorite theologians, Aubrey Grove, she's shaking her head. She said this about speaking truth and love. She said, speaking truth and love means being a people that are filled with, convinced by, and know the truths of the gospel so much that when you speak to one another, you're loving one another by rehearsing the gospel together. What would that look like? What would that look like in your relationships, in your community, in your friendships? To be so filled with, convinced by, and know the truths of the gospel that when you got together, whatever came up, whatever maybe gossip came up or whatever you weren't believing, like all of a sudden the truth of the gospel was spoken into that space because you had that vulnerability and trust. I love how Jeff Vanderstelt uses this example in Gospel Fluency. He says, it's totally true. He says, we often believe something to be true about God, but our lives show that we don't actually believe it. We know a truth we should believe, but in actuality we don't. For instance, we profess belief in a God who forgives our sins through faith in the death of Jesus, but we continue to believe we need to behave better in order to make up for what we've done wrong. When we do this, we are living in unbelief in the gospel. You ever been there? What does someone in that spot need? A brother or a sister to speak truth in love, to share the gospel, to rehearse the gospel, to talk about the same things, to remind them of Ephesians chapter 2. But when we don't have community, we just get tossed around by the waves of isolation, and what's speaking to us there, and that isolation is human cunning and craftiness and deceit. And it's there that we are vulnerable and can spiral so fast from the truth that we desperately need. This is why community matters. This is why God said it wasn't good that we were alone. Look, the enemy will convince you of some of the most atrocious things in isolation. When you don't have friends speaking truth into your life, the enemy will convince you of all these things that you keep to yourself and start to believe. He repeats some of the same things too, and you start to believe it. This is why community matters. Verse 16. From whom the whole body, joined together and held by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. As an illustration, I am coaching football at the high school this year. I grew up playing football, but it's been a while, clearly, since I've played, and never actually coached football. I've coached a ton of soccer, but this year I get to dabble in the football coaching world. And one of the things I forgot was so helpful was how helpful a film session could be, right? And usually the first practice after your game, you have film session. I remember doing this in high school. In fact, I remember a really funny time when my coach called out one of my friends, and we just watched this play over and over again. And my friend was supposed to be running down the hill and downhill and blocking this guy, and he was doing more like a dance, kind of like a hug type of thing. And he just kept replaying it over and over, and we could all see what was clearly wrong with this play. He missed the block, and we didn't end up doing great. And I just remember him watching that film over and over again, and he looked over and he goes, "Hey, Mark, I'm pretty sure the dance was after the game." And I remember him so funny in that moment, and funny now, at least to me, but good memories. But now on the coaching side of things, I see how helpful watching film actually is. And one of the things that stands out and is so clear, it's important in every sport, but I think specifically in football, the importance of everyone doing their job. If one guy doesn't do their job, the whole play gets blown up, right? If one person takes a play off or does the wrong assignment, it really impacts the rest of the team. It's also easy to see how different people are wired and skilled for different positions, how when they're operating out of their gifting, things can go great. Now look, if everyone was trying to be the quarterback on the same play, we wouldn't get anywhere, right? It would be a struggle. And last week, we're like 5-6 weeks into our season, if you count practices and camps and stuff. And last week, had a lineman come up to us and say, it's a bigger guy, good lineman build, come up to us and say, hey, coach, I think I want to try wide receiver. And the head coach just kind of looked at him and said, no. And it wasn't because he didn't have value, right? It was because his gifts didn't fit that role. And there's a really important role he needs to fill. And I was thinking about Community Matters and thinking about our community groups specifically. I thought, man, this is an important principle. And really, this is Ephesians 4, being worked out in the body. Like, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we don't have any film of people's community group sessions. That could be entertaining, especially the ones with like 17 toddlers. But what Paul is saying here is when equipped people in community work together in the ways they're gifted and wired, it produces something that God loves to put on display. But that body is also built up in love, and they experience Christ through one another. And people are gifted and wired in all these different ways that are required to build up the body. But sometimes we can just see a handful of important roles at church or in community and think, man, if I can't be the quarterback or the running back, then I may as well just sit on the sidelines and watch. But everyone has a really important role, and if we don't fulfill those roles, we have an incomplete team. So I want to consider, what does this look like in your community group? What role could you be playing in your community group? Maybe you're gifted and wired in a way that no one else is. What does that look like to come together and be a participating member of your community group? And I've encouraged the community group leaders to call everyone in their groups to have a participating role. Sometimes I think we can kind of be thinking we're being kind as community group leaders and just do all the things and make everything as easy as possible so you can show up and leave and have a good time and not feel any burden about. But I think what we might be doing implicitly is taking away an opportunity for people to work out their gifts in the body, in a small microcosm of the big body in our community groups. And so I really want to see and talk about it this week, like what ways could you serve in your community group? What ways could you use your gifts and your wirings, not to try to be just like someone else in your group, but to fill a hole that's missing? It's a neat opportunity, and I hope it's one we reflect on this week in our groups. We don't want to rob people of being able to use the gifts God has wired them with. I think you might be surprised by what participating in God's community with God's people would do for your loneliness. What an impact it would make on the places that maybe you are not believing the gospel to be true for you. Or maybe you're thinking you're exempt from some of this mercy, grace, and love. But because now you're participating in community, it won't be long until someone is able to see that and speak truth and love to you and remind you that you are not exempt from the gospel, that you don't have to rely on your works to get acceptance, that you don't have to fake it to belong. And I don't just share this from theory. I don't even share this just from God's word, but I've been able to experience this. I experienced this in community group. Early on when we started coming here, I was feeling some shame and some inadequacy about how I was living out my role as a father and leading my family, just feeling like I should really be further along by now. You guys ever feel that way? I really should be further along by now. I still feel that way often, I'm sure we both do. But I remember sitting in someone's living room, just having coffee and cookies and, talking about the sermon and all these things. And all of a sudden, they just simply shared, and this is someone that I thought had it all together, by the way. They just shared how much of a struggle parenting was in that season, how things were hard. And all of a sudden I felt this like weight off my shoulders, like, we can be honest about that? We can be real with our church people? Super relieving. Super relieving. To feel like, no way. You too? You struggle too? And then point each other to Christ. Point each other to the gospel. I was reminded that my hope wasn't in finally being able to figure it out. It was in Christ. And I don't think I would have experienced that in isolation. I think it just would have been a mantra of do better, work harder, try to figure this out. You're never going to be that. No, what does the gospel say? The enemy loves to do his dirtiest work when we're alone. When we don't have someone to speak truth in love to us, we listen to the enemy with different ears. So maybe you feel lonely in this season. Maybe you felt isolated. Maybe you feel like you've missed your chance at real community. I want you to tell something. I want to tell you something that I heard a while back, and I thought it would be too cheesy, maybe, or cliche. I don't think it is at all. But if you felt like this, like, I missed my chance at that, I want you to know you have not met everyone that's going to love you yet. Maybe that's cliche, but it's super true. You have not met everyone that's going to really love you yet. Don't hide from them. Don't avoid community. There's people in your life that you don't even know yet that might be the biggest influences on your life when it comes to speaking truth and love. My deepest friends in life, most of them, I didn't even know who they were 7 years ago. No clue. Couldn't pick them out in a crowd. God is not done with you. And he's certainly not done with the people around you. And he has some really great connection to offer you through community. But it's a risk and it's scary. But wouldn't we look at community a little bit differently if we saw it as something our very lives depended on? So I want to just challenge everyone here to give it a shot. Give it a shot. What would it look like just to consider it? Try out a community group. Since community matters to us, and it is a core value here at Valley Life, we had made community groups a big deal. We talk about it all the time. We probably you've heard about it enough, maybe not. As of last spring, being a pastor of community groups has become one of my main roles, and it is just a value and a desire for our church to really equip and shepherd and lead and care for our community group leaders and the people in their groups. And we now have a team of people that are helping out even more as a layer to connect and support our community group leaders, because we think that so much of God's work happens in relationship, in community, and in community groups. I would really love it if we could get to a spot where everyone that calls Valley Life home has a community group that feels like home. That might seem crazy. That might seem absurd. But if you call Valley Life home, what would it look like to do life with people in this church? You'd have to schedule it, right? I know it's a very busy world out there, right? What do you often say when someone asks, how's it going? Usually, probably, if you're not being honest, you say good, and then you feel a little dishonest about saying good, but then you'll follow it up with, but I'm really busy, right? I do that, right? Oh, things are good. I'm just busy, because that gives me more value if I'm busy doing a bunch of things that I shouldn't be doing. But we are busy, and some of them are great things we're busy with. But are we so busy that we don't prioritize what we were wired to do, what we were made to do, what we were made to need to have to thrive or even survive? So maybe it's something that needs to be replaced on a schedule. Maybe it's just something that needs to be put into a schedule, but our schedules represent our priorities. So are you scheduling in community? Time to gather with God's people and be known and loved. This isn't a guilt trip. Like, that felt kind of guilt trippy coming out. I just don't want you to miss out on what you've been wired to have. I think in closing, kind of, a very helpful way to walk through and share kind of the value of community group and what that looks like and what really relationship looks like in the church is by using the illustration of a home. I'm borrowing this from our friends up at Northwest Gospel Church in Vancouver, which, by the way, if you have any friends or family moving to the Portland area for some weird reason, sorry, Portland, highly recommend they check out Northwest Gospel Church. Made a couple friends that are pastors up there, really excited about what they're doing and just really, I think, pushing back darkness and establishing light in a pretty dark area of the country in a lot of ways. But I want you to consider a home. And I want you to think about the journey from the driveway to the table. And what types of relationships do you have in that journey? From the driveway with our little radio flyer over here to the table. What does that look like? The driveway represents anonymity. I knew I was going to have a hard time saying that word. Anonymity. Where people, who shows up in your driveway? People you're really close to, if they just stay in your driveway? Who is it? It's like the Amazon guy, right? Some of you are probably closer to the Amazon guy than you should be because you're buying too many things from Amazon. But this is the place, the driveway is a place where people are unknown and their stories are unheard. Right? Amazon guy, pizza guy, you know, like your kids might know them because they're always outside playing in their underwear and they're like, oh, hey. But for the most part, people in this space are unknown and their stories are unheard. Is it possible to come to church and stay in the driveway? I think so. Is that a lonely place to stay forever? Absolutely. Might feel safe, but it's lonely. Moving on from the driveway, we get to the entryway. This is a space, a lot of people come in, they actually get to come inside a little bit, or at least people that, what's going on in there? Like, in the door, what's going on in there? It's a transitional space. It's usually kept clean. There's no laundry on the floor in the entryway, usually, maybe, at least if you see them pull in the driveway, you're like, quick, get that laundry to the bedroom real quick before they come in and see it, because we want them to think we're always living in a clean house. But it's not a vulnerable place, right? People in the intro will often show up to some of the big events at church. They might be someone you might know their name or recognize their face, but they're not really known, and they don't really know you. They're still kind of spectators. They might be testing the waters. However, people come through the entryway to get to the living room and eventually to the table. So it's a valuable space. And I think how we interact with people in this space as a church matters a lot. Do people feel like they can be at home just in the entryway? Or does it feel like you're not welcome here? We're too busy for you. You might be inconvenient. What does it look like for the entryway even to start to look like a home, like a curiosity is developed in the entryway of what's on your couch? Unfortunately, many people in most churches don't get past this point. It might feel close enough, closer than the driveway, but still lonely. The living room. The living room is where personal growth begins. These people are participating, they're serving, they're learning, they're building meaningful connections. The living room embodies a place of spiritual and personal growth with one another. Meaningful connections are starting to happen. This is where roots start to grow, right? You start to grow roots. You start to feel like these are my people. I feel comfortable here. I can actually probably start to take my mask off and tell the truth about maybe even just how things used to be hard. We might not quite be to what's currently going on, but we can confess and share like, man, back in the day I used to, and a couple years ago and I think that's like an attempt to be known, but there's another step, right? There's another step from showing how you used to struggle to how you're currently in a spot. But if you're in the living room, you're participating, you're serving, maybe you've come to gospel class, maybe you've joined a Bible study, but I think a lot of people in community group, this is where they're at. They're somewhere between the entryway and the table, usually sitting on a couch in the living room. People know your name. They even know your story. A lot of people in the living room have at some point taken the personal initiative to get connected, which I've got to say, getting connected takes initiative and work. And I want to be as approachable and hospitable and inviting as we possibly can. But you're not just going to fall into deep community without some initiation and effort, right? It takes work. Anyone that has a deep community has taken the time to work at it, has prioritized it in their schedule, and has been real and honest with people, intentional. People with deep community dedicate time in their calendar to invest in it. And finally, the table. This is where we want to be. And look, this might happen in community group. I hope all of our community groups get to this point. This might happen outside of community group. You might have some really great friends that are part of your church, that you do life with, that know you inside and out. This is a value and a goal. And my hope is that being in community group will give you a taste for why these types of relationships are so valuable. This is where people have deep roots. Masks are off. You can come to the table and just be real and honest and vulnerable. In Galatians, Paul talks about how we need to bear one another's burdens. Like that happens here. It happens a little bit here. That really happens here. Dustin Willis, in his book, Life in Community, he talks about these types of burden-bearing relationships. And he says, these relationships are possible only when we know what burdens we are to bear. You guys get that? If you're in a relationship and you don't know anyone's burdens, how can you bear one another's burdens as we're called to do? But honesty, he says, is one of the greatest means for fostering genuine biblical community. And honesty ushers in authentic love. And honestly, makes people feel way less lonely because you're not the only one. These people desire to be with one another. They don't have to wonder if acceptance is on the line. The table is a place where people go from doing to being, much less about what you're doing or what you're watching, but who you're with. And when you're with these people, they know what you struggle with. You know what they struggle with. You know how to respond and attune to them. And you're comfortable with your elbows on the table because it feels like home. This might sound amazing to some, like something you're starving for. And for others, it might sound terrifying. Like, if you're going to try to get me to sign up for this today, I need to leave right now. I won't spoil that. Maybe you've been living most of your life between the driveway and the entryway. And I just hope this morning, this season maybe, this week, you'll consider taking the next step to push through the awkward into more intimacy with others. And that living in Christian community will be like a drink of fresh water on a super hot day. Maybe that you don't know what you've been missing. You don't know that you were actually wired for something that you've been avoiding. And I would love to help you get connected. If you're like, I want to get connected, but it sounds really stinking awkward and clunky, how do I do that? I'm here to help with that. That's my job. And so if you're someone that's in that spot, in between these two spaces, like, this all sounds good, it sounds scary, but I probably should do this. Now what? Well, we're going to help you do that this morning, and I'm available anytime to help you with that. Let's pray.